Hello, this is Lily, and I'm going to be talking about my thoughts on the typography class readings for the week. As for the insightful parts of the reading, I thought it was helpful to learn about informational hierarchy, how to display that using different elements. It was helpful to learn the terminology regarding grid structures as well, such as the gutter, which is the section in the middle, the margins, which is the space between the edges and the content, the foredge, which is the edges of the pages themselves, and the body, which is the area containing content. Manuscript grids, column grids, modular grids, hierarchical grids, and compound grids are the various structures that can be implemented in designing with grids. These all have different feels and purposes, and it's valuable to carefully consider what format to use to make a design as comprehensible as it can be made. These are all helpful considerations for my future design work. Understanding that people naturally like structure and order even visually helps me feel an inclination to work with grids more often and understand them further. Also, knowing exactly what elements emphasize structure or hierarchy will also help me in the future, such as with employing a strong use of contrast, value, size of elements, and so on. Alignment also plays a huge part, with consistent alignment being crucial to grid structures and avoiding visual confusion or clutter. Fully left-aligned designs that avoid centered elements seem quite common in grid structures, and that is a great way to employ consistency. To switch it up a bit, I also really enjoyed reading the Breaking the Grid segments because I got to see some examples of good and effective design work that broke outside of the grid's rules. Good design does not necessarily have to follow a grid or certain structure, and different techniques can be used to create dynamic and intriguing compositions that still make sense or have some kind of order, even if it doesn't follow a concrete formation. For example, even if not all elements flow through on a grid format, like in a stereotypical grid style, order can still be included through formal relationships, perhaps through color, shape, hierarchy through size, and so on. There are also some things to consider when working with grids or straying from them. As for the potentially negative or difficult aspects of working with grid structures, it seems challenging to keep elements perfectly organized. It's important to stick to the structure to maximize comprehensibility, but it is also a little confusing to do that when considering things like spacing and deciding how to combine all elements such as body text, titles, subtitles, images, etc., and how to make the correct ones stand out. This is especially true because all things often need to be aligned in the same way when sticking to a grid structure. It would be too contradictory to have some elements flush left and some flush right, for example, even if it were to, like, say, increase spacing. This especially becomes a highlight when working with typography due to rag. The space created by rag can also be a helpful use of space when considered correctly. Overall, too much or too little space can be distracting. You have to employ it correctly to maximize efficiency. To minimize confusion in the design process, we must be careful when initially choosing a suitable grid or straying from it, because different structures work for different projects. The textbook also notes that grids work best when the designer rises above the uniformity of grids to create a dynamic composition. So this means that the structure must be used carefully and intentionally, keeping things organized but in a way that stands out and creates a captivating, immersive experience for the viewer. All of that responsibility falls on the designer, which can seem overwhelming or daunting. Whether utilizing grids or straying away from them, the text mentions that to avoid a lack of understanding for viewers, it's important to make the major elements easily identifiable, as well as the location of the most important element and how that connects to the following elements visually. Also, the platform the viewer is viewing from matters in considering the structure. If they're reading a magazine, different formats and techniques can be used than if they are viewing on a phone, for example. If in designing a grid is not being used, that can potentially increase pressure and confusion because order will likely need to be incorporated in another way. Foregoing a grid can help a design to feel more free and your creativity can really go outside the bounds, but sometimes the lack of structure or rules can also be a challenge in its own right. It's important to understand how to break free from grids in effective ways. Just because a composition lacks order and increases design freedom does not necessarily make it an effective or comprehensible design. There are challenges for using grids and challenges for not using grids. They both come with unique sets of bonuses and difficulties that must carefully be considered depending on the project, goal, requirements, and so forth. Although it seems a little intimidating, it makes me want to try using grids and not using grids in some experimental design projects. I definitely feel that I want to grasp these concepts stronger, and I may just need to read through the week's readings multiple times to better understand. I particularly want to know more about ways that dynamism can be implemented in grid works and ways that order can be implemented in non-grid works. Hoping that my time in this course can provide me with new insight regarding design structure and techniques, and perhaps new opportunities to practice those new techniques. There are so many ways to incorporate order into projects without using grids, and all sorts of methods I never heard of before the reading that can be utilized, such as pictorialization, vernacularism, or programmatic effects, just to name a few. I like that it's entirely possible to opt out of a grid format in some scenarios and choose to bring order in linking elements in other ways. I suppose I assumed that some of those really dynamic compositions I've seen along the way in my studies followed a grid structure of some kind, so it's interesting to see that that's not always the case. I definitely want to learn to use grids properly and effectively in my work, as well as learn when and how to correctly break out of grid formats in some works. So these are my thoughts for this week's readings. I really enjoyed it. I think it was very insightful, taught me a lot, and I think I'm many steps closer to understanding grids. Up until now, I feel like I have very much just like freely designed, and I think it's kind of important to actually have some structure and give yourself like limits and boundaries, restrictions, because I think that opens up freedom, creative freedom in other ways that maybe you didn't consider before. And sometimes those limits can really be what pushes your creativity and your skills to as far as they can go. So I definitely want to spend some time even just working on personal projects to experiment with some of the techniques that I've learned from the readings this week, and I definitely think it will be helpful to like go back and read them multiple times, because I feel like it was really helpful, because a lot of this I have not heard before. So yeah, those are my thoughts for this week's readings. Thank you for tuning in, and I will talk to y'all soon. Thank you.